Okay, Channel 79, call this meeting to order, a budget review session for the Board of Finance, Tuesday, April 2nd, 2019. Thanks, everyone, for coming. So, on our agenda tonight, we've got a few things. I'd like to start with the Board of Education, and then we'll move on to police. I think the chief will be here at about 8 o'clock, and then finish up with the library, since that's where we have most of the folks in the audience today, which, again, I appreciate your coming. And then we'll move on to some of the other items where you guys can watch it on tape. You don't have to stay. Okay. I sent some, in preparation for the discussion on the Board of Education, Frank, Paul, and I, who spent some time on the budget, we developed a few questions and sent them to the Board of Education in advance to Tara, to give you guys a chance to think about those. As I said in my comments at the top of those questions, I recognize that some of these things have been covered in Board of Education meetings, but with everything on my plate, in full disclosure, I have not had a chance to avail myself of the rich library of videos of Board of Education meetings. And so I've missed some of that, for which I apologize. So to the extent that we can have summarized answers to these questions, and you can point me to other more detailed explanations should that be necessary, that is completely fine. So, Tara, I don't know how you'd like to proceed, whether you'd like to take a look at some of those questions and we can march through them, or if you have other colleagues that you'd like to address some of those.
So why don't maybe Dr. Land and Mr. Keeney come up, we'll hand out, we have answers to questions, and as we go through them, if there's more details and or follow-up to those questions.
Terrific.
What you want to do? We can
That'd
do
be
that.
fine, thank you.
I need the copies, right? Oh, thanks, my question. Of course. So again, on the
Nice
sheet,
to
you'll
see you,
see
sir.
like the synopsis. Dr. Landon, for those who haven't met, I know only being in the district 1 year, some of you haven't had the chance, but I think at our last meeting, many of you did.
He shows well. You should bring him out more often.
I know. No, I love having him, trust me.
Just don't let me
He makes you look good.
So if we begin with enrollment forecasts, I think we also sent the presentation and the PowerPoint from Malone and McBroom, which is one of the sources we do to track enrollment. But we did get asked for another enrollment study, and in November of 2018, Malone and McBroom presented a detailed analysis of the trends and the demographics in town. So you have some of the important snapshots in that sheet, mostly the new developments that are coming on. We tried to estimate how many new students that would put into the district, and it looks like based on their calculations, they're saying 86. Our own internal figures were slightly higher, but this is why enrollment is not a perfect science. But we do 3 different models. Mike Feeney runs his kind of year over year. We have a persistency model, which Malone and McBroom took into account. And then they had their model. They presented both a high, median, and low end, recommending that as we were planning and forecasting, we look at the medium projections. So I provided everyone with that PowerPoint. Hopefully, if you haven't had the chance, feel free to look through it. And if there's questions that come up even after the budget, we're happy to answer those.
It's still, the look forward still is for relatively flat student population over the longer
Yes.
term. So the addition of these students suggests that the non-development, in other words, the sort of base student population is actually declining. If you take out these new developments, is that?
Yeah, so we see a slight decline, and then we see back to a leveling. So these students don't look to overcrowd us, but certainly to keep us at a level. And that level stretches out, I think, to 2029, that it looks
Okay.
like it stays fairly level. We seem to, every time we think we're level, get a move-in rate. Malone and McBroom did acknowledge that we seem to, Darien rebounded, or certainly has maintained its housing prices. I think in there it says there's been a slight dip. But we do find over the summer that we experience unexplained or unexpected jumps, but the overall is a flat projection for enrollment for the foreseeable future.
Inclusive of the developments?
Inclusive of the developments. Coupled into that, there was a question on the physical capacity and limits in our schools and where they were most critical. I think we touched upon that during the budget handover. And so the average age of our facilities is about 50 years old, with the oldest being Holmes at 85 years old. Darien High School and Tokenique being the newest are in the most superior condition. 4 of our 5 elementary schools utilize modular classrooms to accommodate the existing educational program. There are concerns with educational categories reviewed during the master planning process by KG&D. That was to remove the portables, the location and the centralization of the early learning program, which hopefully will be taken care of by the Oxridge project. Size adequacy of educational spaces. This has to do with having older facilities that were built for educational specs at the time, if there were any, and any new building there, new educational specs. Common areas, we are finding our common areas are small, and you'll see some of the details there that physical education was doubled up a few years ago. And we did gym class in both cafeterias and gym. Because we just didn't have enough space to house kids. So those common areas when we rebuild and those classrooms certainly need to be resized to updated specs. But we are managing with the current buildings we have. I do think we're managing well, but it does present some limitations. But I think the question we touched on last time was the willingness to redistrict if we needed to. And no one likes that word. It's certainly people are attached to their neighborhood schools. But I do think the board certainly would look at it if needed, and or as these new developments come online, the first instinct would be, okay, what district are they in? But if there are schools that have space, much like we did with Avalon a few years ago, and we took Avalon, which was districted for homeschool, and we moved it to Tokenique because Tokenique had room for those children and Holmes was stressed. I think, I feel confident that this board would look at that and make those decisions as needed for the best overall impact to the district. And I think that's what this question was most getting at, but if there's a follow-up there, I'm happy to answer.
Just one nuance there is that a lot of times it's at a micro level where you trigger a capacity problem. So if you have an influx of students in one spot that goes to one school, where you're at the margin in terms of sections in that school or even classroom availability, from this focus growth with these developments here, do you see any issues with that in terms of running up against capacity at a micro level in a particular spot or with numbers of sections in particular schools?
No, I don't think we're seeing it because at this moment it's best guess with sections about where those students will come in. When we looked at the projections for the Heights project, I think at the time we were projecting at an elementary level, we were seeing the influx, or we would see the influx, and that's not what we found. What we found is we actually were gaining students at the middle school and high school level. So sometimes it's hard to predict who's moving in and who's coming with them. But we don't see anywhere that is particularly stressed for it at the moment. However, we would be willing to adjust as needed.
Just, Tara, I raised this, I think, a month ago or so. When we, and believe me, we understand, Mike, your job is difficult. There's a lot of sensitivity that goes into that multivariate analysis. But we were pretty far off with Avalon. We were not as far off with Kensett. Are there any lessons learned from those situations, or does the consultant really just take the demographic data from a contemporaneous setting? Are those relevant?
Do you want to answer or do you want me? Go ahead. Well, I do think when Malone and McBroom presented, they did look in depth at the projects. So I do think they had some sense, and they were able, because they talked a little bit in their presentation about the differences in the types of projects, and so what led to some of their assumptions around them. Avalon, historically, and this is from my memory of being in the audience at the time, we were under. We thought we'd get much more. Kensett, we were far under.
Yeah.
And so I do think sometimes it's what's attracting people to Darien, and entry into the market, and the ability to stay in an area versus an area that's seen as more transitory, or a development, I should say, that seems to be a factor. But I do know that Malone and McBroom looked at all the plans, kind of where they were situated, what they were intended for. But I do think it is an educated guess.
Other questions on this particular point?
So we move on to school psychologists. We don't see any particular potential for any additional expenditures. There's no administrative support or additional state reporting requirements that having the psychologist would necessarily bring. The board asked this question of do we anticipate near or midterm requests for more staff? Because quite frankly, when we saw the responsibilities of the psychologist, we said, well, how
They're
can two
underpaid.
people do all this? That said, the administration feels strongly, and you can feel free to provide any more detail if you want, that this should be enough coverage. And I believe part of that was looking at different models.
Yeah, I'm prepared to say unequivocally, there'll be no additional expenses associated with the employment of the psychologist.
Okay, was your experience?
Unequivocally.
Was your experience in Westport when you brought in the psychologist,
We had-
that coverage in fact was
And it didn't-
sufficient for a longer period?
Yeah, we did in Westport. There were no additional expenses other than the salaries of the psychologists.
Okay.
Do you want to talk a little bit, just for a moment, about when you brought them into Westport, your school survey climate, the effect that the psychologist had?
Yes, certainly. We did a school climate survey, and the results were overwhelmingly, just a couple of years after we put them in terms of student satisfaction with school, students feeling safe and secure at school, having someone in the school who they knew they could always go to. Kids look for individuals who they can reach out to. Oftentimes it's the classroom teacher, but for others that isn't simple. So they'll go to a guidance counselor or a school social worker or the psychologist. And in the elementary schools, 9 times out of 10, they'll go to a psychologist.
And some kind of survey like this is what you'd recommend for this district, even 2-3 years out, to check these
Yeah,
types
safe
of
school-
sentiments here?
I think safe school climate surveys done every 2 or 3 years are important surveys. I think gives the Board of Education, the administration, building principals and teachers some insight as to whether they are achieving the goals they hope to achieve with students in terms of anti-bullying, kindness, concern for others, and the like. And I think it's a decent measure, and the state gives a lot of support to local districts that want to do a school climate survey. So they're experts to help us.
It says down here in the dot points you provided that one of the metrics or measures you're planning to look at for the success of all this, the point is increased staff development and strategies to support students in social and emotional health. This obviously goes beyond the psychologist. Could you speak to that briefly?
Yeah, I think, it's hard to measure success on mental health issues. I'm not sure I'd know how to do it, actually. So what are the indicators? I think you have to look at the macro, situation. And so if we're going to measure how much time psychologists spend with students and families in proactive and responsive support, that means not just in special education activities. And that was the purpose of this, to spread them so that they could meet with every kid and give every kid real assistance with problems that they may need or issues they may need assistance with. So we're going to measure the time that psychologists spend with students and families and see if, in fact, the time they're spending on group counseling, like, for example, kids who are experiencing death in the family. We'll always get children like that. We want to know how much time they're spending with incidents such as that. That'll give us a good measure of whether our goals are being achieved in terms of how psychologists are spending their time. And also, we're going to take a look at how much staff development our teachers are getting from the psychologists in dealing with crisis situations or difficult situations with individual students and groups of students in class. So I think those are 2 good measures.
Right.
They're as quantified as we can get, and in the future, who knows? There may be more ways, more metrics in which to measure it, but for now, I think this should be more than sufficient.
So I think one of the things the administration did a good job, at least for the board, in hearing is if you look at what's being asked of general education teachers. Right? You're supposed to teach, but now you're also providing mental health supports. Well, that's not really what you necessarily went to school for. And teachers by nature are loving and caring, but some of these are very specific. And so the administration really also mentioned that the psychologist would have a role in kind of adding to the toolbox of the classroom teacher so she can best manage her class or his class. I will say, adding FTEs is always a question that we think of and we know the Board of Finance is going to ask. So we did look back over the last 10 years and found that we had a compound annual growth rate of 4.36% for the budget. Of that, regular education classroom teachers had only grown 0.09 and had only increased by 3 teachers. So if you start to look into and include our special education teachers, many of those are contractual. We would expect an uptick after kind of what town went through. That included the addition of, let's say 17 teachers. It's like 16.89, I think. And that accounted for a 0.48% increase over the 10 years. Now that doesn't include when we decide to bring in a whole new program like our SES facilitators, but it does include our certified staff that are in our classroom. So I do think we've tried to be very careful. In terms of enrollment, we have seen a small dip in enrollment, but we haven't tried to be really thoughtful about who we're putting in our children and managing that. And so I think it was a great analysis by Mr. Feeney. If you have additional details, he can speak to that. But it really was a great way of looking at where are we adding, how are we adding, and what are the effects of when we add. And overall, I think a 4.36 compound annual growth rate is something to be proud of overall, given all that we are delivering to our students. So if there's any further on that, I think we're happy to answer questions, or we can keep moving.
Oh, sorry.
I have a question. In the original memo that you sent to the board, you talked about the fact that the current psychologists lead school are spending either all or most of their time just in IEP, dealing with SPED IEP programs. And I assume the number of IEPs have grown over the past 10 years. So in terms of dealing with like the issues that sort of just come up during the day that are not related to special ed, like how are those being handled? Presumably, if they're spending most of the time on special ed, there's virtually no time to deal with these.
To be perfectly frank, by the seat of our pants, with the high school, the school principal, the assistant principal, they play a role, and our SESS people all play a role in dealing with what would amount to serious issues that the psychologists can't deal with because they're so involved with the PPT process or testing and the like. That's one of the reasons why we proposed this, and it was unanimous, as I stated in that memo, with building principals and the administrators, because now we will have the opportunity to have true professionals, 2 of them, working with those situations which we had to deal with on the fly. It'll be more structured, it'll be better, it'll be more thorough, and it will better address the needs of all of our kids.
And so is the idea to keep one psychologist in each building focused solely on?
No. In fact, we're working on a plan where we'll have each of the psychologists responsible for a full grade so that they can follow kids through as they go from kindergarten through grade 5. So that would give each psychologist a responsibility for 3 grades in the building. Thus, they will be responsible for the special ed kids and the regular kids, and it will enable them to broaden their perspective and be able to deal with all kids on a regular basis.
So the idea is that each one will spend half their time maybe working with on IEPs and half dealing with issues that sort of come up?
Generally speaking, yes, but in practicality, I suspect they're going to find themselves working maybe a little bit more with the non-special ed process.
Well, certainly more than they currently are now, but I think what the important part is when a family develops trust with a psychologist, moving that trust through the whole school, rather than every year trying to reestablish relationships. Some of these issues are incredibly personal in nature. So if you can devise a system where the family has a trusted known entity to deal with some of this K through 5.
And let me add to that, that's really the philosophy of the school district, in the sense, remember, we also added a guidance counselor at the middle school. The purpose of this is to have individuals totally familiar with kids in a grade level from the very beginning, and following those kids through from kindergarten through grade 8, which enables somebody in every school to know a family and those kids incredibly well from the time they enter school until the time they leave. And as their siblings come into school, there's a family history that they know of. So overall, it works to everybody's advantage: parents, kids, teachers, and community.
And was there any discussion about, rather than adding 4, of having sort of one psychologist be available to sort of deal with issues, and trying to have some, possibly have a psychologist that adds sort of IEP support to 2 schools?
Yes.
And sort of phase it in over time to see, do we need to go from 5 to 10, or can we go from 5 to 7? And reevaluate just, it's like at the elementary school population's down about 5%.
Well, the members of the Board of Education were very thorough in reviewing this request, and that is one of the questions that came up. And we were able to demonstrate that that doesn't work, based upon even our most recent experiences, where we just put a psychologist back into a school full-time, where last year the psychologist was mobile, if you will, jumping from crisis to crisis. And what we really want are people who are in a school, in a stable environment, knowing families, knowing kids, and staying with those kids, and being able to address all of the family and child needs as they progress through school. You can't do that with part-timers who bounce around, crisis here, crisis there, and so on, in different
I was
schools.
talking more like on the IEP, does it make sense to maybe share any psychologists across 2 different schools to deal with
So I think
the IEP, the needs that they have there?
Well, I'm going to say the same thing holds true for, all kids are treated fairly and evenly. And what we would want in terms of counselors and psychologists staying with the family and kids throughout their career, it doesn't matter if they're special ed kids or not. They were typical and atypical. So we need people who know our families.
It wasn't special ed kids, it was just dealing with like IEPs, which seem like there are meetings that sort of take place all day and so forth, like that type of role.
So I
versus-
think what you find is through 7 different schools, if you had someone dedicated just to that, there are multiple things. There's IEPs, there's testing, there's team meetings, and so it would be an overload, I think. We at one point had one psychologist in every elementary school and then one in the central office who could be that mobile person, and it proved to be inefficient. So I think we looked at several different models of this. Some said, to your point, add 2 and let's phase it in. And where the board came out is that in every scenario we tried, what we were trying to do is save FTEs over solving the problem, and that we felt more responsible addressing the problem at the level it needed to be addressed than, God forbid, something happening and saying, we were going to phase that in over time. We felt the administration made a compelling case based on what they were seeing, and we felt that their recommendation was strong enough.
Okay, thank you. Capital projects, priority 2 projects?
Sure. This came up on our building tour, and though I think Jamie also touched on it during the budget handover, given what's going on in Hartford and maybe some reduction or the possibility that there's legislation that could reduce grants or make grants harder to apply for, we re-looked at all of our projects to see if there was anything grant eligible that we could accelerate. And in that review, we think we have appropriately planned. We did not see anything. Mr. Lynch, who's also here, presented a list of things, but he felt strongly that we were in line with where we needed to be. And I think there is nothing to that question of could you move anything now and try to capture where we are, where the grants stand now. We have not seen anything that we could move forward at this time.
Okay.
ECR, always a fun one to talk about. You asked the calculations. Just as a quick review, ECR is 4.5 times your per pupil student. So you see there, it's roughly $95,000 is the threshold. After that, we get reimbursed on a percentage point. At one point, we were reimbursed 100%. That has changed. Right now, we are estimating to be reimbursed about 73% of the money above that cost. We are projecting a decrease of 6 students who are eligible for excess cost in 1920. So our projected filing estimate is $3.9 million, which at 73% gives us a reimbursement total of $2.85 million, and we budgeted as such.
And nothing since when you budgeted that and today has suggested any change in that?
No, and Mr. Feeney is happy to speak to it.
No, not as of yet, but obviously there's an unknown factor as well as.
Mike, there's always an unknown.
I know.
Well, often it's, this is the hardest part about this formula. I mean, when you come up with an algorithm and then you don't actually work the algorithm, it makes it really hard for the people on the ground trying to plan for it. Because if students present with needs all of a sudden that pop them over, and I don't say that casually, but push them over the $95,000 threshold, all of a sudden our mathematics change. So we try to look at the December filing. We ask if there's any updates, and as of now, we're still on point for this $2.85 million.
Okay. Other questions on that?
What has been your experience over the last couple of years of people moving in August and all of a sudden you have an extra 3 to 5 special ed children that need this kind of help?
That is our experience. That has been happening when we look at our reimbursement as to how it basically, when we look at how much money has been brought in for the reimbursement, you'll see there's significant swings as to what we projected and then what we had actually brought in, and you'd also see a significant swing regarding our expenditures as well. So it happens quite frequently, more often than not.
And Mike, when you're projecting this, are you doing it, I know you can't speak to individual, like students or anything, but do you do this sort of on a micro level where you're taking sort of individuals and rolling them forward, or are you looking at just, well, transportation was $100, it's gone up by 3%, so it's $103 this year? Like,
No.
We're looking at the individual level.
So we have to, in order to apply, and we have someone who's dedicated to watching this and tracking this. Because it is such a complicated and detailed formula. So I think, Mike, you gave like what an example might be on the sheet, you know, a sample tuition, what tuition might cost, and then the percentage of it which is actually reimbursable to us. But we have to do it and submit back up to the state for every single individual child.
in terms of submitting the claim, like when you're forecasting for next year, are you doing it on an individual student basis?
So right now we're doing it on an individual student basis. We're working with our early learning program, identifying those children and how they're progressing. We look at the transitional periods as well, the grades. We look at the potential classroom size that they're going to be in, because one classroom size could actually have a swing as well. If you had a student that's in a class of just 2 or to 5, and now they're transitioning into 10, that changes the makeup of this number. So we do look at all the transition 5 to 6, and then going into from middle school into high school as well.
And is that because you can then allocate like, you know, 10% or 50% or 20% or 10% based on the class size?
Yes,
Of that
depending upon
resource?
how big the class size is and the resources that are allocated to that one student, yes.
So the other thing I'd note is over the past couple of years, we have gotten more to actual reimbursement. We generally had a very conservative model to try to plan for fluctuations in the state. We've gone more to actuals. So the board year over year, as we bring this back, might see fluctuations because we're at 73% this year because that was our experience last year. But if our experience changes drastically this year, you'll see a different number. So I think the Board of Finance was pretty used to seeing about a 68, 69% reimbursement, and we've tried to really pinpoint it to give you the most accurate number we can. But with that, you should expect a variance in numbers over year. It makes us a little more bullish, but we're trying to present to you as much in real time as we can.
That's better.
Have you looked at like what you submit and what they actually accept? Like has the accounting, how we account for it and how we submit it, how does that accuracy play out over time?
it's accurate, and you would know at the end of the year as well. Because if we oversubmit or undersubmit, it would have a negative or positive effect, and thankfully it has a positive effect over the last couple of years regarding your excess costs, your educational cost sharing grant.
Do you have any opportunity to share transportation with another district for common students going to a shared facility?
Yes, in the past, not today, but in the past, as of last year and the years prior, yes, we have. We typically have agreements. We have transported kids to Stanford, Norwalk, Wilton, and New Canaan as well for our out-of-district placements.
Good. Chromebook and iPad replacement and upgrade cycle?
So overall, the replacement cycle has worked. The elementary and middle school students now receive their Chromebooks to start bringing back and forth from school in 5th grade, and it stays with them until 8th grade. The Chromebooks have been lasting that entire 4 years. I will say, having experienced them at my home, not with a little bit of wear and tear, but they do make it all 4 years. At the end of 8th grade, those Chromebooks are retired. And so that's where you see in our budget a regular replacement cycle at this point, not a new purchase to buy. When children go to 9th grade, they're issued an iPad, and this iPad will stay with the students all 4 years and will be turned in upon graduation. Our first round of iPads to be retired will happen next year. And everything at this point says that the iPads are serving students well and resulting in a reasonable replacement cycle. We are in the process of developing our new 3-year technology plan, so that also will take all these factors into account, and as that's developed, the board will continue to have reporting out on it. But at this point, both our purchasing and replacement cycle seems to work as we planned.
Terrific.
John, just one question. I listened to last week's meeting. You had your IT professional kind of talk to sort of how the kids are using the iPads in high school.
He's our assistant principal up at the high school.
Okay.
Yeah.
So have you guys done any work in terms of how much the students are actually using the iPads versus, like, per se, bringing a laptop or other sort of devices? Like how many hours per week or per month are being used? Just, anecdotally, it seems like there's certain ones that just don't use them, and there's a lot of kids that bring their own devices. So I was just wondering, do we track what the actual usage is?
I can let the
Per
superintendent answer it, but we are aware some students choose to bring their own device because they feel that it works better for them. But overall, we're seeing students use their issued device.
And they have to have access to the websites that we control as well. I think virtually all of our teachers integrate the iPad into all of the work that our kids do. And by the way, just as a side note, in terms of fiscal responsibility, which I'm sure you would like to know about, if a child loses it, or does damage to it, and it can't be fixed, we require that family to purchase a new one at their expense, not ours.
Okay.
So Jim, to your direct question, I don't know, and we could follow up if there's any direct tracking on the number of hours.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that, just because I do think, I've seen sort of a growing population that are, maybe not turning them on and using their own device a little bit more. So it'd just be good to know, like, how many are actually using them.
Okay.
Okay, very good. Department chair responsibilities?
So the change in the budget here is when department chairs came in, we had them teaching one class. What we have found, and the superintendent can speak more, well, we can talk two things. Sorry, I didn't want to skip ahead and miss one of your questions. So what we have found is the department chairs are certainly a success and have provided great feedback both in mentoring their teachers and actually making sure that there's equity among classes, but still letting teachers have the creativity to teach their own class. But there are now common midterms, there are common finals, So there's a way for us, as we're making sure students are going through the high school, they're actually ending up at the same point. Someone is not stopping at the Peloponnesian Wars while someone else is making it all the way to studying the Vietnam conflict. I mean, we needed to make
That's
sure.
quite a leap, by the way.
Well, Western Civ is a really long class. So first, it's working. What we found is the department chairs, the value in them teaching their students was great. However, when the students went to go access their teachers, those teachers had administrative responsibilities and/or responsibilities towards other teachers, and the students weren't able to access their teachers as openly as they could other teachers. And so there was a concern both by the department chairs themselves saying, I feel as if I'm not serving my students fully, and then meeting my administrative duties. And we heard, from some families that, why isn't my teacher available in the morning or after class like other teachers are? So Dr. Landon can talk to it more, but I think the administrative team brought it to his attention.
I think Tara described it very well. The truth of the matter is they have multiple responsibilities. One of the most important is supervision and evaluation of teachers, and the other is being involved in curriculum writing. And they were unable to do both satisfactorily and take care of their kids. And they were split. Some had much of their work at the high school, but they had a period at the middle school, or vice versa. One could be spending time at the middle school. So they weren't always available to meet with their kids, and that was a real problem. But now, under this proposal, we will be able to really get in and regularly and systematically supervise and evaluate teachers to make sure that teachers are performing at the level that we would anticipate, both in the classroom and out, actually. In curriculum writing, Tara mentioned Western Civ. The social studies chair has been actively working on that because the community raised questions to the board about the nature of the program and how it could be better in terms of addressing the needs of our kids and making it exciting, more interesting, and so on. Not as lengthy in terms of its perspective. He's been working on that. And that's at the middle school and the high school level. And the same is true, for example, in the English department, where there are lots of things being undertaken to see how to make the curriculum more relevant for our kids and how to do away with some of the things that were just burdensome and probably did not serve the kids as well as they should. So I think you'll see that across all departments.
I can't help comment. This is the area that was initially, when I first saw the proposal, the least attractive to me. And you've made a case here that I'm following. I'm not going to object to it. The case is that the teacher evaluation oversight, you've even used the word coaching, would be improved, curriculum development, and so on. What we don't know, and this is your job, that's not ours, is the management of that in the nature of the ecosystem of teachers as to who might aspire to that role and what incentives they might find in that role, it not being an honorific, it being a real important role. And I thought it was quite, I observed, given the work I do, that it was quite insightful. About a week ago or two in the Journal, there was a great story about middle managers and the clamoring to get promoted and this is industry, but this is similar to teaching, that the great athletes, so-called, would aspire to be in some of these roles for possibly the wrong reasons, when in fact what we're really looking for in middle management are coaches. And this notion of a relationship and the development of people. And everyone, given their various competencies and intrinsic talents, are not well suited to coaching. So the selection of these people is critical for it to be successful. Critical. So I'm not opposing it, but it's just a huge management responsibility to exact what is the promise of doing this work.
Well, that's why I'm excited being here, finding your HR director in place who does an incredible job of just that. Because I sit in on all these interviews, you know, when we have key positions, whether it's department chairs or building principals and so on, and the kind of work that goes into selecting candidates, looking at all of their talents, their experiences, their capabilities and abilities. I think you guys are really fortunate in this town. You got a great HR director in the schools, and I think she does all that really well.
So I would add, from a board point of view, the board has requested, in the long 2 years the department chairs have been in place, each year that they come in and they present on exactly that. What are you finding? What are the struggles? What are the successes? And let us understand how you're actually affecting students and how much staff buy-in you have. Interestingly enough, we've gotten a fair amount of feedback from parents who like the idea of, if there's a problem at the teaching level, instead of having to go directly to a principal or an assistant principal, they can go to someone who knows the department, who can best understand where the disconnect might be between the science and the parent and the teacher and the student. So I would agree with you. I think every year the board has brought them in for that reason. We want to make sure that these people are effectual, and we have been incredibly pleased, quite frankly, by the talent that we have seen.
Jim, or sorry.
To that end, I remember when this first was introduced a couple of years ago, there was a lot of discussion on how we were actually going to measure the impact and the effectiveness of these individuals. And can you speak to that a little bit? What anecdotally, I understand that there's discussion with the board, but are there concrete measures that you look at that indicate what the impact of putting these chair positions in place have?
Well, first we have principal at the high school and assistant principals. We have principal and assistant principal at the middle school. We have guidance counselors who have insight into what's happening with kids and what's learning in both schools. We have our assistant superintendent for curriculum instruction supervises and oversees the work of these people from a supervisory point of view as well as curriculum point of view. So there are a lot of people in the mix. And of course our best critics are our parents, because if we have problems, they let us know. And you know, oftentimes that's probably one of the very best avenues that we have in order to determine whether things are being done from a parent's perspective, and so we can investigate that and look at it from an administrative point of view and see, well, maybe there's truth in what they say.
So the board also doesn't manage staff, but I will say when the department chairs have come in, first the mandate of going to common midterms and common finals. One of the questions I was asked of department chairs is, how'd that go, right? Because where you might see problems are in classes where, okay, now you have a common test and what are the results? And I think that they, because it's not our purview to manage staff, but without saying that, they said we were able to see, and we were able to then co-teach with certain teachers where we saw discrepancies, or we were able to talk with the teachers who had, maybe had some reticence. Why am I doing this? And I do think those are measures that, while we're not getting teacher names because we just can't, and to hear them talk about their work in that way, I think they're finding really measurable results. I think what they can do is look across, because I have parents calling everything, sometimes even how kids did on tests, and I send them to Dr. Landon. Sometimes if you have one class that bombs a midterm, well, what's going on there? And so that's one of the most concrete ways, I think, if you're really looking for a metric that allows them to go in and say, what happened here? And sometimes it's not bad teaching, but maybe you need to adjust. Maybe your group of students needs it in a different way. And so I think that's probably the most concrete example that I can come up of, but this is where I'm veering slightly out of my lane.
All right. Other questions on this point? Francis?
A couple of questions. Is this a common model for comparable sized districts? And does this show up in test scores at all? And then finally, is the expectation that these department chairs will be in that role semi-permanently, or will they rotate in and out?
As we have introduced it, it's not on a rotational basis. But obviously, if department chair is not doing the job, we have the option of having that department chair not continue in that role. And I think we're pretty studious about that, making sure that people are doing their job and doing it well. As to whether it's common, it depends on the district. I think the districts who really feel strongly about having people who will oversee departments, will ensure that the curriculum is appropriate and is updated and meets changing needs. I think in those districts you'll find full-time department chairs. It used to be that the model was they would teach 2 periods and be department chairs for 3. They were in the teachers unit. They weren't in the administrators unit. And that caused sort of a conflict. But when you have them as administrators, there is no conflict with the teachers. They're going to supervise and evaluate. They're going to supervise and evaluate without any concern about being boycotted, if you will, by the whole department, which has happened in the past when it was 2 and 3. So
I think it goes back a little bit to Jamie. They're real managers.
yeah, and I think it's the best plan, really.
You know, currently, are all of the curriculum coordinators, are they listed under are they administrators or teachers? Like, which contract are they underneath?
They're administrators.
Okay, and but they were also teaching last
They're
year.
certified staff, so they can teach.
But last year they
If
were
anyone-
teaching one class, is that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Okay, and the year before that, we just had like a stipend where one teacher sort of acted as the coordinator.
Yes,
is that correct?
we had a situation where they could offer advice to another teacher. Like, we had people who were in a stipended position, and they could make suggestions, but there was not an enforcement mechanism. The issue would have to be raised to the level of assistant principal or principal in order to have enforcement.
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily talking about like evaluation, but just in terms of coordinating the curriculum. 2 years ago, we had individual teachers who just taught the same class load, who just got a stipend to do all this. Is that correct?
No, they weren't doing all this, is the answer. They,
You think they're doing
yeah, they,
Were they not the sort of evaluation role, but coordinating the curriculum? Like, is that what they were doing 2 years ago as the?
I don't think you can compare the two positions. I hear my curriculum behind me. Go right ahead, Susie.
That's correct. In the past, they did not have the ability to coordinate the curriculum because they simply did not have time within their workday. They were given a coordinator stipend to support what they could, but the reality is, in terms of writing curriculum, revising curriculum, supervising and evaluating teachers, coaching, none of those components of the current role were being implemented in the past coordinator stipend.
And the majority of the coordinators that we have now, were they previously teachers in the district?
Not the majority. No, we have 2 that were teachers who rose to this level, and then we brought in outside teachers. Or Christina might have just been hired, so it might have been 3. She might have just been hired.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So 3 of 5 came from internal?
Mhm. Although, in all honesty, one of those individuals had just been hired and had been hired because she was such an outstanding person in the field that when she immediately applied for this, she was the right person to do it.
Okay, very good. ELP?
So ELP enrollment, as you well know, we look at this every year. There was a question about why a jump in 2022. So as a quick review, and I'm sorry because I'm sure you're familiar with most of this, ELP is a state mandated program. It is a 1-to-1 full inclusion program. So for one child who has learning needs, they need to be around typically developing peers. And so every year, this is a bit of an adjustment. And in fact, we sometimes over-enroll typically developing students because we know throughout the year we will be accepting more students into the program as they are identified, and we want to remain in compliance. So we are projecting class sizes with a range of 10 to 15 students. Going up to 15 is a change in recent years, but we are, working within our limits and trying to meet the needs of all students. We are currently averaging, by the end of the year, 98 to 100 students. And so with that, we also know by talking to the area preschools, by talking to the state Birth to 3 program, from where a lot of children who are receiving services then come to us at 3 years old. We know best estimates, kind of what's coming. And so that's how we begin to put these enrollment figures together. As you're aware, at Ox Ridge, we are looking to combine this program into one space. And so we've tried to do that, allowing for the most adequate way to build it. We don't want to build this program for 8 classrooms and then all of a sudden say, oh, we're so sorry, we needed 2 more classrooms. We need to build 2 more classrooms. So all those factors go into planning for the 2022 jump. Again, it's one of those things that's hard. All throughout the year, we are enrolling children. In our October enrollments, we'll see, okay, 90 kids are going to be in ELP. But as students present with needs, particularly at this age, you can accept students as late as May and June, and you must. And in accepting the student, you still must make sure you are in compliance in a one-to-one setting. So it's a little tricky. But I'm sure, because ELP comes up often, that this is how we plan.
Okay. There was a point about tuition there as well.
Yeah, so tuition, every year we go out and we review on an annual basis kind of area preschools. So part of needing to stay one-to-one is you need to stay in the mix. You need to make sure you're not outpricing yourself. You need to make sure also for the robust program that we're having, we're not underpricing ourselves. At some point, a question came up about, are we covering the cost of educating? No, we are never probably going to be able to do that because the cost of student needs swings so much that you couldn't necessarily pass that on to the typically developing student. So we go out, we survey the area preschools. We try to stay in the mid-range of that. This year, we actually upped our percentage increase to 4.5%. That engendered a lot of board conversation. But at the end of the day, we felt that that was appropriate, and we felt that that was keeping us in line and in pace with the area preschools. So that's really our goal. We need to stay attractive. I believe we have a fantastic program that makes us attractive. But also people have choice, and we need to stay compliant with a state mandated program.
What are the kind of admission, how many applicants for each one of those regular spots? How does that compare to the other preschools?
Well, we always have a waiting list. So do you want to talk a little bit about, or Shirley, do you want to talk a little bit about applicants?
Right. Well, right now, I think.
Shirley's our Director of Special Education.
Good evening. There's generally a waiting list for both for children who are typically developing. And right now, we're very fortunate this year. We will hit about 98 students by June, actually, because of children turning 3, and that happens at different benchmarks during the year. But currently, all of our seats are full right now, and that we continue to be competitive with the other neighborhood schools.
Okay, good. Other questions on this? Last 2 questions. Shared services.
So shared services. So this is where I think schools have been doing it longer than anybody else. We share services in many ways. We've got the Connecticut Regional Education Consortium, or CREC. We have a purchasing coalition. Actually, we have 2 of them for which we participate in to try to capture economies of scales with neighboring districts. We also look at programs that we can capitalize. Stanford has a very well-regarded continuing education program for students who are older than 18 that's still receive educational services, and so we partner with them and to be able to send students there. Likewise, I'm sure as you know from last year, we opened up Fitch Academy to the idea if towns wanted to talk to us about sending students there and we could meet needs. We have a partnership with the YMCA that is around our facilities and their facilities. We also send students to various regional and magnet schools. We send kids to AITE, for example. We'll send them to the magnet at Rogers. I do think that there's also a lot of professional development shared services, Connecticut Association of Boards of Education, CAPS, which is the Connecticut Association of Superintendents. We know we have to do this. I mean, we know we need to do it purchasing. We know we need to do it transportation, which I think is the next question, and Mike touched on earlier. If we're sending a bus up to CES, we want to talk to all the towns along the route and see if they want to help share that cost. And in years past, we have, as Mike said, at the moment, today we don't. But if the opportunity presented itself tomorrow, we'd be sharing that cost. And I think Mike notes we've done it with New Canaan, Wilton, Norwalk, and Stanford. So we look for as many ways to share services because often schools are responsible for so many things that we all have kind of the one-off or the one traveling somewhere. And if we can, buy paper together, share transportation, it helps all of us. So I really do think we look at this, and every chance we get, we do everything we can to share with neighboring districts.
Questions on this point? Frank? Okay. Last question was just about contracts coming due for negotiation.
Sure, I mean, it's right there. Our custodians, maintainers, and cafeteria contracts are all set to expire June 30th, 2019, and we've begun negotiations. We have our teachers' contract expiring 2021, so those negotiations will be this summer. You usually give us a member. Frank's been fantastic. He has spent many late nights.
The man.
And drives some hard bargains. Even our attorneys were like, well, Frank Huck be back. So we appreciate all that, Frank. And our administrators are 21, 22.
Okay, very good. Those are all the formal questions that we submitted to all of you. Again, we thank you for spending time on all this and appreciate your patience in the fact that some of this may have been redundant with comments and work that you've done in some of your board meetings. Does anyone have any questions on the Board of Education budget for the assembled group?
And
Okay,
I think
friends?
we let you all know that it had gone down to a 2.03, but in case we had forgotten to mention that, we are at
Okay.
a 2.03.
All right, I want to encourage you not to stop there. I don't feel like it's a final kind of ending.
No.
point. You,
Like I say, if we can find another pocket like that, Mr. Feeney, please let us know.
yes, we anxiously await such news, but appreciate the news to date, and thank you all for coming this evening. We are thankful.
Thank you.
Thanks. Chief, next.
You know what, though, I feel for you so much.
One hour for board. Okay. Chief, we're going to talk about police next, so if you'd like to come up, Captain.
Unless he's a colonel, is there such a position? I'm kidding.
She probably went to Admiral or something. Gentlemen, thank you for coming. We appreciate it. And
Thanks for having us.
No worries at all. So I know the senator spent a lot of time on your budget, both this time and in years past, so I will hand the mic over to you, sir.
Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming.
Sure.
I am going to practice the Jamie McLaughlin School of Budget Review and not go to line-by-line review. Um, Just some questions on some key areas I think that you're prepared to address, and I think we can get through that pretty quickly.
Hope so.
And we're going to get to this dispatcher group. Let's say that's the pièce de résistance. But for the time being, if we can, let's skid around on some other issues. One thing that came up in the Board of Selectmen review, gentlemen, was the repurposing, the replacement program on vehicles and the repurposing. You know, I was sort of left with a dull note. I'm not sure exactly what the conclusion was, except that this is something we want to do. This is something that is a good idea, and that hand-me-downs could be, in fact, utilized in other departments. So what? And candidly, this goes all the way back for me 7 or 8 years with Fred. I mean, God bless him. But if I may, we had bad vehicles. We did. There were, you know, the maintenance routines were irregular. Now we have a steady state, better vehicles. So, anyway, what's the policy on vehicles?
The policy?
Just general repurposing, maintenance, and then the notion of handing them off and handing down.
We have a great maintenance program. Our maintenance mechanic, George Knapp, takes excellent care of the vehicle.
And he's a half-time in that role?
He's full-time.
He's full, okay.
Yeah. He does all the routine maintenance on the cars, the oil changes.
Let me step back just for, again,
Yeah.
for my colleagues. The fleet management, as I used to call it,
Right.
is vastly improved, and dramatically improved. So I'm on the margin here, just trying to understand, this was an issue that came up in your review. So I don't have a criticism, I just want to understand where the policy is.
Well, the vehicles are normally traded in when we purchase new ones, although some of them are repurposed to some other
What's the
county.
market for the trade-in? Who makes that market? I thought
We get an estimate from the dealer on what the trade-in value is. But keep in mind that, you know, although they're, what are they, 3 years, right? They're 3 years old
Yeah.
when we trade them in. They have a lot of miles on them, and a lot of engine miles on them, so it's not
hours, not miles.
hours, right? So it's not peak market value for those vehicles. But if we have a vehicle that the town is interested in, certainly we work with them and we turn it over to them. And our vehicles are normally very, very well maintained as best as possible.
No other comments. Actually, literally, that comment came up. First select person, Jamie Stevenson, is here, and it was sort of an unfinished sentence, and I've always been intrigued by our fleet program, and
I might be able to just expound on that just a little bit.
Yeah.
We don't have a formal program to repurpose vehicles to any town department. Typically, the administrative officer will call me and say, listen, we have a need in X department. Do you have a vehicle do you think that you could give us?
Yeah.
We check our inventory, and typically, most of the time we do. Now, the town's fleet maintainer, we've had conversations about going forward that I think should be explored to have a expanded system. He would like to get some of our cars earlier to
Right.
repurpose to other town departments. That's something that certainly I think the chief too would be willing to have this conversation. We get everyone on board that if they want some of our cars earlier, that we would have to develop a town-wide plan to do that. You know, our administrator cars or our detective bureau cars, they don't go 3 years. They go 7, 8, 9,
Right.
10 years because it's typically assigned to a much smaller cadre of officers. And they're just not getting the same use. I think it's something that we would be open to discussion with. But I think right now it's working pretty well. I think we're giving them cars that are serviceable, although they sometimes have a lot of high mileage on them.
Okay. Kind of a minor issue, but in the area of shared services, it would appear I think we do a very good job with our animal control officer. They've been to our property a few times with some very strange animals.
He's a busy man.
Including a fisher.
Yeah.
Are
Is
they
there?
after you or your pets?
Well, it depends on your perspective. Is there an opportunity for shared service, shared animal control officer with Stanford as being bandied around?
This has been brought up from time to time, not to my knowledge. We've looked into, I've heard that Stanford was supposedly building a new facility.
Closer to Darien.
But that's not come to fruition.
Let's just count that as a minor. If we can move to the dispatcher issue. So the case is implicitly improved utilization of sworn officers.
Correct.
And that's axiomatic. The full civilianization displaces 2,920 policing hours, which is quite a statistic. Good statistic to have. So I've not quarreled with the secular case, the overall case. We have a proposal from existing staff to do an SRO at the middle school and a narcotics officer. So in some of the moving parts here, I'm focused on that 2920 policing hours. Stay with me on that, holding that constant.
I believe that figure is just for day shift. That's just for day shift.
That's just
right?
day shift.
Right.
So is it,
Right.
so it's multiplied not by 3, but maybe
Right. No,
2.5 or something?
I'd have to lay it out. but
Okay,
yeah,
well,
roughly.
that's quite a statistic then.
Right.
Okay, excellent. Middle school SRO.
Right.
The person is displaced from where? Is that related to the dispatchers?
Yes,
Because we're holding constant our sworn officers at the end of the day.
you are, yes. Right now, if this proposal goes forward, where we would have day shift and evening shift covered with civilian dispatchers.
Yeah.
Okay? That allows us the flexibility to take 2 officers from the patrol schedule and place them, one in the middle school, and then I can take another one and place him as a narcotics, him or her, as a narcotics officer in the Detective Bureau, one, with minimal impact on services.
I just wanted to enunciate around those 2 issues, that we're not just adding all of these people, we're getting at least 2 differently utilized people of the fixed sworn officers
Right.
in the way this is being done, with the notion that implicitly we're just getting just a better mileage out of our sworn officers.
Right.
Here's a hypothetical, and I'm doing this just for the purposes of some testing of the case. And this is for the public at large. This is a very significant commitment to go the full mile and get ourselves to 9. What if we don't go to 9? What if we go to 6? What if we end something short of 9?
Well,
And I-
go ahead.
Go.
Well, the 6 would cover day shift and evening shift. If you don't go to any more than that, then we would have a case where on the midnight shift, it would be status quo, where it would be a police officer, one police officer covering the communications desk. It's pretty much as simple as that.
I'm throwing that out there not because I'm proposing it. That's not for me to propose.
Right.
But it is, in fact, a case, as we watch the succession of this, that may be something that is raised in the future.
Well, but I think that would be, not something I would support. I think that would be the incorrect way to go. I mean, if we're going to do this, we should do it right, and we should civilianize our communication center. You know, you'd have just a limited amount of officers working in there on a midnight shift. You know, if you have officers that jump from day shift to evening shift to the midnight shift, then they wouldn't have the skill set of answering, you know, working in communications. They'd have to go through kind of a retraining period in order to work in communications, and it would not be an effective way to do things. I wouldn't support it. I wouldn't like it.
Well, I'm sure of that. I wanted to make sure that was out there as
Yeah,
a
understood.
possibility. I have one last question, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues. This is your call, and you've worked with the Board of Selectmen to make your case. But issues have been raised, and certainly I want to know that in this contemporaneous environment with communications technology being what it is, that we are in fact at a standard, best standard, on a regional and national level. Now, as much as I know about state government, I had to write this down so I could ask the question. I didn't know we had a Department of Emergency Services and Public Protection Division of Statewide Emergency Telecommunications, the DESPP-DSET. Now, under their protocols, under their standards, we are implementing things at best standards.
Correct.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Second, there is an Association of Public Safety Communications, much easier, APCO. And the nature of what we're learning about in terms of best practices for telecommunications, we're incorporating whatever's being done as a best practice in any municipality, anywhere in the country. We're alert to best practices.
That's as far as training our telecommunicators go, yes.
Actually, training is really not the issue. The training, I think, which we're doing is certainly by the state standard, one would hope is fairly straightforward. No, I'm talking about the actual communication centers, the technology, the routing of calls, what types of calls are being done, where they're shared and why, that kind of a thing, which implies that there's some shared services for combined emergency telecommunications. And these are things that you guys have to be witness to, you're participating in. And I just need the confidence that we are at the standard of best practice.
We are, absolutely.
Well, it's your call. I needed to air that one out, notwithstanding the DSEPP-DSET comment.
Well, just let me expand on this a little bit. We've been trying to get some information from the state on our 911 system, on how many calls we get in our 911 system. We get about 6,000 calls, just 911 calls per year. We just got this information today. We are at or above the statewide standard for answering 911 calls in less than 10 seconds, 92% of the time. So our record's pretty good.
Well,
I would dare say that it's much quicker than 10%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or 10 seconds, 92% of the time.
So let me finish on this, and I just throw this out there. So I perused the 2014 proposal. I think I read it 3 times. I read the update in 2017. I followed your colloquy when you came in for your review with the Board of Selectmen.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to have the answer tonight, but it's an answer I think we need to be really focused on. I don't really, other than the implicit displacement of the sworn officers for better utilization, I don't really know what the success factors will be. It was never presented. Could it have been presented? Yeah, I suspect hypothetically. But it is in that orientation that I would urge you to begin thinking through, how do you want these people to be measured? Your call. But they'd be protocol-based. You have great data this year in our budget report, which Kate presented to us, so we have some units of measure year over year. I would urge you to be thinking about that so that we actually can do a look back and say we did something that had really positive incomes, not just better utilization of the sworn officers. So I leave that to you guys to contemplate, because I think it would be, when we're fully staffed, when we have a full 9, I think it would be good for any one of those individuals and for the department.
Sure.
Other questions for the chief or the captain?
I'm curious, at 6,000 numbers, is there a trend line that goes along with that one way or?
Like I said, We met last week with representatives from the state Emergency Telecommunications Center. We've been trying to get this information for a while now, since we just got the new next-gen 911 system put in 2017. And this is new information for us, so we're going to explore it further and see how far back we can go as far as, is this holding steady? Are we getting more calls? It actually breaks it down into, people that are calling in via cell phone, from landlines, how the calls are received. So it's information we're going to have to sort through and see if that's relevant. And again, this is only 911 calls. This is not routine calls that come in.
And what percentage of those calls result in a dispatch of officers?
It's kind of hard to say. Again, we'd have to sort through all that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I could even give you an accurate number on that.
Seems like a big
Some of them
number.
are missed dials, but they have to be answered. Some of them are hang-up calls where we do have to send an officer, if we have an address to go to.
And candidly, some are 5 or 6 calls on the same
Yeah.
collision.
Or
They still have to be answered, you don't know it's on the same collision, so it has to be answered and communicated.
Thank you.
Other questions?
You just, in terms of looking through for like training and other types of professional services, given that you're going to be taking some of the officers and moving them from like patrol to narcotics or patrol to, from Board of Ed, like SRO, is there any additional sort of budgeting that you have in there to go through the necessary training to move them over?
We have, if we get the additional, if we're able to put an SRO at the middle school, there will be a week-long training that he has to go to, he or she has to go to. It's minimal, but it's just a conference that they go to. Other than that, as far as training for an SRO, there are occasional classes that they have to go to, but nothing of major consequence.
And on the K-9 side, is the K-9 set up to support that effort?
The K-9 I'm sorry, I'm not following you.
Yeah.
Our
to
K-9
supplement
unit?
the narcotics effort?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Well, it's two different things. Our narcotics officer that would be assigned to the Detective Bureau would work with our K-9 units in the event that they have to go out and do search warrant, surveillance, something of that sort, for sure.
Great. Other questions?
With respect to the movement to civilian manning of comms, are there other area police departments that have made that move that have had experience with?
Yeah, that's the trend, to move police officers off the communications center out to the road and to put civilians inside. We're one of the few that still has police officers answering.
Yeah, I'll comment on that. We're quite behind, actually. Some comparable towns. The Newtown, Farmington were used as examples, and they were fully staffed when we did the study 5 years ago.
Yeah. Terrific. Other questions? Chief, Captain, thank you, gentlemen, for coming.
Thank you very
Appreciate
much.
Thank you very much.
it. Okay, we will move on to the library. So Diana and I have looked at the library budget, and of course, we've had multiple discussions with Alan and team over the course of the development of that budget. And then we had a phone call with them, I guess in the last couple of weeks, where we kind of went through this in final form, and of course, it's been reviewed by the Board of Selectmen. The only questions I had were fairly minor in the scheme of things, and maybe I could just jump to a couple of those, and then to the extent that you had anything else that you wanted to mention about the budget, you certainly could do that. Just a few quick points. I noticed in the budget that the Eversource loan payment wraps up, which is terrific. When you look back at the cost of utilities following that change by Eversource, did you actually see a decline in the cost of those services?
Yes, when the purpose of it was a 40-month loan, so we could relamp the library from compact fluorescent to LED. And we're able to track the use of particular parts of it, and the use of our energy directed for lighting went down by 40% immediately from that. So it was a significantly measurable effect.
That's really good.
And just to point out, we're open 80 hours a week, so that kind of savings gets amplified significantly.
Right. It's a headcount projection. I know that's been fairly stable and that you've been trying to address some potential salary disparities with regard to other opportunities your staff could pursue. Do you expect your headcount to be stable in the coming years?
Yeah, there are two elements that you spoke to. The first is that we did have the 3 years of the 5%, thanks to the town for allowing us to do that, and we did a good job of catching up to our peers. We are short of them, but we're close enough that it's not an amazingly difficult distance to cover. And now we're back to a 3% increase this year for our staff. We don't see any immediate requirements for increases in staff.
Okay.
What we have done, if you look at the way our use is lined up, is we have always worked around behind increases in staff. We don't increase in staff because we think something is coming, but we wait until we see a significant effect that demands that we do something, and then we've increased it. And we don't right now see anything that would call for us to increase staff.
And the only other question I have was just a quick status update on the geothermal repair work that I know is consuming friends rather than town budget.
The geothermal work that we're doing this year is the first of a 3-year project. The total project cost will be about $2.4 million, where the board's investing about $1.2 million this year to reconfigure the standing column well system that we had when we opened the building to a closed loop system. And involved in that are drilling 4 900-foot wells. And then when that's done, and they're connected to the building, then to reconfigure the 4 existing wells that are between 1,000 feet and 1,500 feet, so that somewhere one side or the other of Memorial Day will be finished, and then we won't have the problem that we've had for the past 5 or 6 years, which is a change in water quality that's affecting the operations of the building. The next 2 years, what we're going to have to do is, again at board expense, to change out the HVAC systems internal to the building. That's about $800,000 to $900,000 on top of what we're investing now.
Okay, the last point I'd make, just a couple, is it really is remarkable to read the page 6 statistics in your presentation about the service to the community when it talks about the Darien Library versus all others in the state, first in the number of visits, first in circulation, second in Wi-Fi and computer use. I mean, the statistics go on in terms of the fact that this is a significant facility in the state of Connecticut, and it's thanks to the Friends in terms of the physical plant that was built, but it's really thanks to your management of that place, which I think is terrific. Questions from others? Diana, do you want to comment on anything?
I did want to comment on the excellent work that was done to keep the operating budget, actually have it go down. 100% of the increases are due to staff investments. And so I think that the library did a really fantastic job of trying to find efficiencies. I had a question on the long-term ramifications of the HVAC and geothermal systems. I mean, the expectation is they have a long life and will regulate the heating and air conditioning issues that have been taking place in the library?
I think there are 2 issues. I think you're asking first, how does this compare to a standard HVAC system, which might be a chiller and a boiler? And we looked at that choice when we decided to do this. The life of the wells that we're digging is 50 years. That's pretty well accepted. If we had gone with a chiller, and then boilers in the building, they would have to be replaced over 15 to 20 to 25 years, so that we avoid that doing it. And our analysis was, instead of putting in the geothermal wells of about 1.2 million, the initial cost of putting in boilers and chillers would have been maybe $100,000 less than that. But the 40 to 50 year lifetime cost would have been 3 times as much. We almost don't have any additional cost from what we do now. We get a slight reduction in energy cost and a slight reduction in maintenance costs. And then what we avoid is having to replace significant parts, the boilers and the chillers, every 15 to 20 years. So it makes good sense from a capital perspective. It also gives us a slight decline in our operating costs. What it does give us also is the capacity to increase the size of 2 of the HVAC units in the building, the upper levels for people who use the library in the summer on the south side of the building. They'll know that it's not comfortable, and the plan is to make sure that it's comfortable year-round.
Makes sense.
Other
I
questions?
think we covered
No?
pretty much everything.
How are you financing the,
We're taking those funds directly from the library's investment account.
and do you effectively pay it back? I'm just trying to understand.
There isn't a natural way to pay it back. What the library will undoubtedly be doing is doing some fundraising with respect to any other capital work that we're doing, but we're going to have to rebuild that endowment. We started it at about $10 million. We'll pull it down by over $2 million. Because we use the endowment to fund the Friends expenditures, we bring over an average of 5% of the lagging 3 years. Every $1 million that we spend on infrastructure like this reduces by $50,000 each year the amount that we have to spend on books and programs and computers and things like that. So it's going to hit us on that side, on the Friends side, pretty significantly. We're already looking at those adjustments, and we're also thinking about how we're going to rebuild our investment.
So Frank, you're going to get a letter, so get out your checkbook when you get it.
There's
Real
a couple
soon
of
now.
us from other friends.
They know where you live.
Just for the benefit of the people on Channel 79, so in effect, is the investment account, is it subsidizing the town in terms of the town budget, or the payment?
What's the Friends component
The
of that?
operating
To the
expenses?
extent that this investment will reduce to a certain extent the amount of the energy demand in the building, yes, that's a subsidy to the town. But that was the effect when we put in the materials management system. When we put that in, we actually reduced the number of staff that we had. That's just the byproduct of this private-public partnership that we've had since at least 1960.
Well, thank you.
Very happy to do it. Yeah.
Other questions, Senator?
Just a quick one. Was pleased to hear your general comments about the 5% on the margin actually having had an effect. You can see the market effect right now. So we're in the same business cycle. It's still a positive employment market, and we're losing fewer people.
Yes,
You can
so
actually
far,
say that.
fewer people.
Yeah, terrific.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, no, that's the whole point. We are, as you said, more than 100% of our increase is relates to staffing and benefits. We're a knowledge organization. You can always think of your staffing as either an asset or a cost. We think of it as an asset, and that's what we invest the most in for that reason.
No, you were
Yeah.
quite persuasive when you made
Yeah.
that case.
No, and you all were very helpful in supporting it.
And I want to indicate, by the way, that, remember my comment before, that the assistant director that's sitting there is just, seems to be grossly underpaid. I had to see her at 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon at the library. I didn't see you, Alan.
Yeah.
Only-
Both Caroline Lopez and Mallory Aarons certainly deserve much more money than they're getting.
They're putting up with you, so.
And
Well,
the,
yes,
and,
that's
and the show, the program, I can't help myself, was extraordinary.
Yeah.
It was
Thank you.
great.
Paid for by the Friends, Jamie.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, friends, much appreciated. We, as always, are thankful for the thoroughness with which you pursue your budget process, and it's an example to everybody, so thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay. A few other topics to cover. Excess cost and other grants, and then the Reserve for Capital Non-Recurring Expenditures, grants and revenues. So some of that's mine and some of that's Frank and mine. But what I did today was, starting with capital grants and revenue, I sent a few questions over to Jennifer, which we can touch on very briefly, but were helpful. One of them was just a comment on how the building permit revenue was estimated, and so what she's done there is she's taken the average of the last 3 years and then taken the estimated fees for the new projects that are coming on board and simply taken half of that, and I think that's a reasonable estimate for those grants, so thank you for that. I further asked just why Parks and Rec program fees and what was the basis for calculating that increase. This is actually, I mean, minor in the scheme of things, but just the point being that you had put these on the balance sheet before, now you're just going to run it through the P&L. Could you review that briefly?
For years, the programs that Park and Rec, they cover their expenses with their registration fees. Those have been handled through a balance sheet account for years. And that has just been growing and growing as they come up with all these wonderful new programs. They're basically small programs. And once the fees are, the expenses are covered, any quote-unquote profit was already coming over as program revenue. That's not the best way to do it. We're not capturing about $500,000 worth of activity that they're doing. It's not running through the budget, so we're looking to move it off the balance sheet, get it into the P&L. And
465, right? 465.
495.
495.
And accurately show the full extent of what they're doing in their department.
Does this mean there's any debits sitting on the balance sheet that need to be cleared because they've accumulated, or?
Yes.
And how much is that?
I think the last time we looked at it was around $80,000.
Okay, it's not terrible. All right. Francis?
No, I was just gonna say that 495, I forget now what page it shows up on,
Two different places.
2 different places.
Right, it's on the, we brought it in, the exact same amount in on the revenue and expenditure side, so budgetarily it's neutral. But if you only look at what the expenditures are going up, it will impact our percentage increase on expenditures.
So does that 80,000 need to be appropriated in the budget and then just used to reduce?
What we'll have to do is actually, it's also a timing issue, so it could be that at the moment that I looked at it, they accept registrations before the program, oddly enough. And so when it comes to year end, we'll have to take a look at it and see what registrations came into that account that are actually going to be for programs that occur after July 1st. So it'll be some accounting entry. I think more than likely we will end up with some excess in that balance sheet account that will come over and subsidize the general fund.
Okay. I had a couple other questions, but I'll dispense with those in the interest of time. The one to focus just a minute on is on the estimates for interest income. So this year there's a $300,000 budget for that. It's a significant increase from last year's budget of about $175,000. There's been debate in F&B about whether that number should be raised as part of this budget. So Joan, our treasurer, provided a pretty detailed explanation in terms of how she calculated and came up with that estimate. It's several pages long. I will dispense with a reading of that for the record, but simply stipulate that, in my judgment, it was a pretty thorough discussion, not just of why she budgeted what she did, but the basis for doing that, how investment income works for a town versus a corporate or a private entity, some of the limitations she has to deal with, given that it's a corporate entity, both in terms of regulatory compliance and the propensity of lending agencies or banks to provide a basis for investing these funds. And I found the discussion compelling, and I'm not inclined to change what she's recommended for interest income on this. Jack, I will invite you to comment on that. I've held you at bay up until this point, but I want you to want you to know that I will allow your comments, but not too many comments, because it's getting pretty late, and I've been up since 3:30 this morning, and I may fall asleep on television. So, but if you had a couple of comments on this, I think it's fine. The only other thing I would say about this budget at $300,000, not to say that this would be a reason for leaving it in place, but we actually face a fair bit of uncertainty at the state level. And the reality is, having something like this that might be modestly under budgeted, given some of the things that we're having to deal with in terms of uncertainty, having something like this in place, which would be a source of budget surplus should it come up, is not a terrible thing.
At a slight Jack Davis, 197 Hoyt Street. At a slight disadvantage in not having that analysis.
I thought I forwarded this to you. This is the one.
That's fine. I might take a slightly different approach.
Go.
The board spends a tremendous amount of time talking about our debt, which is now between $50 to $60 million. And we're often worried about the 10 to 20 basis points. But on a simple calculation of our cash flow investments, we're probably between 40 to 50 million as well. And we spend a lot less time talking about that asset. I think that if you look at what the current rate environment is, I think that 300,000 is far understated. We have already achieved that in the first 7 months. And while I'm not suggesting if we invested in STIF, which is currently at 2.4, if you look at $40 million, giving some range, Bert, who has much greater knowledge of this than I did, and I've spoken to STIF people at more than one state, we'd be in the $800 to $1 million range. And I'm not proposing that that's what we do, because there is risk on the building depending upon when we actually get shovel into ground and other things like that. But there's a lot of little spots where we have some cushion. And the question is, raising it to what our simple calculation was, which was about 500,000, on a 40 million investment when rates are currently at 2%, is not unreasonable. And I did do something because Joan did provide some documents, and we haven't been correct sometimes, and sometimes it's simply because the Board of Finance increased a level that was just unsustainable. And understand, we're not talking about whether or not Joan does a good job. That's not the question. We're questioning the budget. And so I think F&B feels very strongly that a $500,000 amount is not unreasonable and is very attainable this year in a 2% environment, where STIF is currently at 2.4. And even if they swing it down by 25 basis points, which they wouldn't be doing to the summer, it's still a reasonable benchmark to go to. You know, we can go through multiple calculations that we have done, and it's just, where do we want to put it? So F&B and the RTM cannot...
Some members of F&B.
All but one.
At least.
Was there a vote on it, or?
We didn't vote on any of it, but we also didn't have all the information at the time. And I did speak to Jen about what the basic cash flow document is. I spent a lot of time doing cash flow in my life. And so we have the rough range. We know what STIF is. We know what the mutual fund range is right now. And so our numbers come out differently. We in the RTM cannot adjust income. That's one thing we can't do. So we asked you guys to look at it. Ultimately, we will be satisfied with whatever you come up. That's your purview, not ours.
Yeah.
The only thing we can do is ask you to review and explain why we have.
Yeah, so I'd like to send around Joan's note just to make sure everybody has it. Taylor, you've got the note from her, is that right? Okay, you ought to send that around to F&B if you haven't done that already, but we'll certainly make it available here. I hear what you're saying. I think the uniqueness of Joan's role as the fiduciary for deciding these types of things, the uniqueness of trying to invest town funds the way she does it, some of the limitations she faces on all that. I get that you've developed some cash flow models and you've got a perspective on interest rates and all of that stuff. The way she lays out this discussion here, I think she tackles that sort of point by point and says, yes, but. So yes, I understand all that, but I face these constraints, these unique aspect of investing these funds. And I think it lays it all out in enough detail that I'm convinced that it's different enough from what I've heard has been debated with with F&B. And so I'm inclined not to recommend a change to this budget for that reason. If you had this secondarily, I think it's good in this particularly uncertain environment that we have certain budgets like this that might have some cushion in it. And because of that, I think just another reason not to change this. And I mean, maybe my colleagues would disagree. I don't know if Ms. Stevenson, you had any comment on any of this, but my inclination is to leave this as budgeted.
I'd like to read the memo before
Yeah,
I
I mean,
say a word.
So, I mean, we're not voting on any of this tonight. I want to make sure that this note gets sent around. Jack, I'll send it over to you. We could discuss this again on Thursday and the following week, so we've got some time to go through it. But as it stands right now, I mean, hearing kind of both sides to this, I'm inclined to go with what her budget is for that. So maybe we actually have her come in and talk about it a bit if after reading this memo there's some questions about it. But that's kind of where I am on this at the moment. Okay, just briefly, unless Jennifer, you had any comments or further? Just briefly, the only other ones to mention that were grant related is I'd asked for a discussion about just what's included in miscellaneous state grants. I knew this and had forgotten it. Could you just briefly tell us what's in that figure?
The main recurring item is an emergency management grant that offsets about $10,000 of the Deputy Fire Marshal. He's our emergency management director. It offsets about $10,000 of his salary. In the past couple of years, there's been a lag. Some years we haven't gotten it. Some years we've gotten multiple awards. They've kind of gotten more timely on paying that. So I expect that we'll receive one payment of that in fiscal 20. And the history does look a little strange because we had about $200,000 come in 16, 17, and about $82,000 in 17. 16, 17 was about 200,000, 17, 18 was about 82,000. Those are not recurring grants. The ones in 16, 17 were actually primarily old reimbursements on school security and a FEMA grant. And the $82,000 last year was the police body cams. So we can't expect those to continue at the same level. We've historically budgeted about $65,000 for the last few years, but we're looking to bring it down based on kind of what we see as the environment for these non-recurring state grants.
Frank, do you have any revenue-related questions or anything I've missed? Okay. All right, that was all I had on capital grants, revenues, excess costs, which we covered earlier, and other grants. I think the only thing on our list remaining for budget discussion tonight is anything on debt service that you'd like to talk about, Jim?
Yeah, so I guess I would say, Jen sent around, I think, an email to everybody. If you look at versus the budget that was originally.
I think that only went to you and John.
Okay.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Enlighten us.
So originally we had about
I think I missed
10.8
that.
million. Originally, like the Board of Selectmen had, and Kate had budgeted $10.8 million for debt service. It's what we owe, so there's not a lot of guesswork in there except for related to this $4.1 million bond deal that we just did. That $10.8 million assumption assumed that we were going to repay a little bit of principal in the first year, but as you know, in this, we don't pay any principal in the first almost 3 years. So basically, that's gone down by about $200,000, just because we're not repaying not repaying about $195,000 worth of principal, but then interest went up a tiny bit because if we're not repaying principal, we have to pay interest. So, long-winded way of saying debt service this year will be down about 1.2% versus last year. So it's about $140,000 less than last year. And that reflects the bond deal that we just did.
But Jim, it also is reflective of the declining outstanding debt, isn't it?
Well, yeah, so if we talk about that for a second, if you look at where debt is going to be at the end of this fiscal year, assuming we make our last $8,000 bond payment, we'll be at about $61 million, and that reflects the 4.1
Yeah, I want to make sure we recognize that, and given where we, and I'm not going to cite the year, but we went up just barely over 100 at one point within the last 5 years, so it's been quite a steep decline, and that should be reflected in those kind of numbers.
Yeah, we've been paying down about $9 million of principal per year, and then this year, we paid down another almost 9, and we borrowed another 4. But, in terms of the amount that we're borrowing, we're not borrowing money just to pay it back in 1 year or 2 year. We pushed out a little bit, which slightly extends our average life. So, the reality is this year we're looking at a $10.6 million number, down about 1%. Now, the only caveat I would say is when we look at capital items, I know we're not going to discuss those all tonight, but if things like Highland Farms, if we want to bond some of those expenses, well, I don't think we would have any principal in this upcoming year, but there would be a smidgen amount of interest added to that.
Based on the timing of the issue, we may not have any interest in the fiscal 20 budget. Because if we bond around the same time that we are now, that we just did this year, we wouldn't have an interest payment in fiscal 20.
Until the following.
So we can control that based on when we actually issue.
But obviously, there's the loss of interest income on the cash that we would otherwise have.
Right.
Yeah, because if we do, we talked about this a little bit with the storage facility, because I think there's some questions raised there. Like, once we approve something and it can be bonded, we can use cash that we have and pay for the beginning or all of those expenses depending on the size of it. And then once you accumulate, this was a relatively small bond issue, but once we accumulate sort of $4 to $5 million worth of projects, we can then go out and bond it.
Good. Okay. All right. Anything else on debt service for town or sewer or any of that? All clear? You have any questions for Jim about any of that? Okay. I think that covers all our budget topics for tonight.
I think we missed building control.
One thing I wanted to bring up, does anyone have an idea in terms of the $61 million of principal outstanding, what % is allocable to schools versus town government?
No, that would be, is that a little guessing game, James?
Yeah.
How about 68%?
I was going to say half.
The schools are about 43%.
Yeah,
Around
schools
there.
are around 40, that's what I thought.
The town's about 52, and then
shocking thing is
our
schools
sewer
are
charges are about 4.5%.
Very good, and I'll bet that after the high school and that period 10 years ago, it would have been the other way around.
Yeah, so it's the first time in a long time that the
How
school
about
debt
that?
outstanding is less than.
Very
town debt.
interesting. Good point, Jim.
So
I'm sorry,
I mean, the schools
In fact, a trick question that I was trapped into.
Yes.
The schools have been aggressively paying down their debt service.
All right. Make a note, that trick question for the senator. Let's keep that up as an agenda item.
Got 'em.
Agenda item number 3, trick the senator. I'm sorry, we've missed building control.
Yeah. So there's actually not that much to say about building control. I think it's a small reduction in the budget over last year, so I think we can address it relatively quickly. And Jim, chime in if you have anything you want to add, but most of the budget drivers are personnel. There's a senior position that retired and was replaced by a step 1 employee, and hence a slight decline in the overall budget. I think one thing to note is just the revenue estimates. Every year we keep assuming significant increase for new development, and this year the assumptions were revised downward as we're now assuming that some revenue is going to be coming in the current year. So that would be something maybe just are we still thinking that they're going to break ground on Corbin in April and May?
No, I've heard June, July.
Now it's June, July. So there's some of these revenue projections will need to be revised again based on what happens with those 3 projects. And I think these assumptions in this budget assume that Corbin's going to break ground before year end and bring in some revenue. If that doesn't happen, obviously they'll be revised a little bit. And the rest of the assumptions are that the other projects all come online, all 3 projects come online in the coming year.
Fantastic.
And I think that revenue reflects part of what we talked about in planning and zoning you last week, but that includes higher fees. I think that came effective, was it last week?
P and Z had higher fees that were approved by RTM.
But not the building permits?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
Hey, just a fact, while we're on the subject of factoids, I covered building with Diana a few years ago, and I remember my most salient point that I left with was how we see building cycles, and therefore building permits, the cyclicality of them are that they move in long cycles, long multi-year cycles. And I don't think, there's a crystal ball here, but, given where we've been, this can't last forever. But you see a pretty nice upward movement here. But that long cycle thing is a fact of the building trades and how that works. At some point, that will clearly be reflected in what are pretty rosy numbers, and they have been for years.
Yep. That's a good point. But with all this new development coming on, I think
Yeah.
we have some expectation of. One other thing I didn't mention in terms of the slight reductions that you see in the budget here is there is that software maintenance and support that has moved out of this budget into zoning. So you'll see a little bit of an adjustment there.
Thank you. Just one other item for our agenda. This is a transfer of $10,000 that we would take out of contingency reserve. The purpose of this is to fund a survey for Ox Ridge Elementary School, which is a prerequisite to some of the work that the building committee is engaged in right now to move that project ahead. So something we definitely need to have. And there's a little transfer note here to that effect. So having sat on the building committee and discussed all this, I can tell you that we do need to do it.
So moved.
Thank you. Jamie, second. Diana? All in favor? Okay, 6-0. Okay, that's it on our agenda tonight. We've got a meeting coming up this Thursday and in 2 days. I think it's protective services or all other topics, so we'll be here
Mr.
for
Chair,
that.
do you need a gurney to get home this evening?
No, I think I will be okay. I live sufficiently close by that said gurney will not be necessary. Okay. I think that's it for me. Anything else? Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Okay.